everyone. Welcome back to LifePoint Students Online. We are actually in week 5 of the Season in the Minor series. Just a quick announcement before we get started is that if you haven't seen yet online, or maybe even last week's message, we're going to be having our in-person gatherings here September 13th from 6:30 to 7:30. So if you're okay with coming, we're going to actually meet outside on the new patio. There's going to be a fire pit out there. We're going to use that space for a good long while to be outside. And I just encourage you, if you feel comfortable in coming, by all means. If you feel like you can't, these messages will still be online, going over the same material that we would in person. And if you come, again, we're not going to be here terribly long, 6:30 to 7:30. Which used to be 6:30 to 8:30, and that time may come back. I look forward to that if it does. But in the meantime, we'll be out there 6:30 to 7:30. Just come out. We'll have a kind of an activity of sorts. Have your mask handy, even though we will be distant, but and outside. But make sure you have your mask handy, just in case. And then we'll have Bible study and discussion. And again, just really try to get back to some sort of sense of normal. So with that said, I hope to see you there, and if not, we'll see you here. But as I said, this is week 5 of a week in the minors, and we're talking today about the prophet Amos. And if you're not familiar, or if you haven't seen some of these lessons or anything like that, the season in minor is talking about the Old Testament minor prophets, and minor meaning their books are just a little bit shorter, whereas a major prophet has a much more extensive book. Many more chapters, and so the minor prophets, like today's Amos, Amos is a little bit long for one of the minor prophets, but it's still rather short comparatively. So, without further ado, let's talk about Amos. So, what are some quick facts about Amos? He was a prophet around the same time as Jonah and Hosea, which puts him around 760, 750 BC. Amos lived in an overly prosperous time period in Israel, which also means therefore Jonah and Hosea were as well. And that's going to be kind of the problem that we're talking about today. The stuff that comes with that prosperity. Well, anyway, so what does it mean when Israel was being very prosperous during this time? Well, they were both politically and financially secure, which is very important, enjoying the blessings of the promised land and so on. And again, as I said, the prosperity brought on a very moral corruption, and even worse, a very religious corruption. So people at the time were very corrupt and not really in their beliefs, in their practices or lack thereof. And so they kind of had forsaken doing the things that God had called them to do. And the very few things they did, as we'll see, was really just kind of out of habit or chore. So some other things about Amos. Amos's book emphasized that God was the God over the whole world, not just Israel. Now, Israel, yes, was God's chosen people, but that's kind of part of the message here, is that while he was they were his chosen people, and of course they were not being very faithful, God's message still, his reign was over all of the world. Amos's messages are pretty blunt and focus more on judgment than on forgiveness. And that, I think, would also beg a good question, is who is Amos's audience? We'll talk a little bit about Amos's background and why that's important as well, but think about it. Who was his audience? If all of Israel was rather prosperous, I would imagine his message, really, his blunt message, his warnings, were probably meant for the mass of the population, probably the greater part of the population. Because that was really all the people not being faithful. It was pretty much everyone. So, no, that doesn't mean that there weren't some faithful ones, but you know what I mean. Many other prophets, comparatively, emphasized love, grace, mercy, forgiveness. We saw some of that in the last other prophets. Amos emphasizes justice and righteousness. And his kind of prophecy is more general foretelling, which is kind of talking about the things of the day. And you've probably seen that trend throughout all of these discussions, that of the two kinds of prophecy, one kind of future way future, talking about kind of prophecy. These are generally more of talking about what God's going to do in the meantime, kind of prophecy. And that kind of makes sense because it was during these times that the people were being unfaithful. They were living improperly, and it was now, and God was trying to say, I'm going to address it now. So that kind of makes sense also in terms of prophecy. So with that, let's move on to this kind of section is, how can we break down, how can we kind of nutshell the overall message or messages found within the book of Amos? Well, Amos's chapters 1 and 2 is really just talking about God's judgment or his coming judgment or what he will do to the nations surrounding Judah and Israel. He's basically saying God's going to bring judgment on all these surrounding nations. And these are those same nations that, Israel thinks that they're better than, right? Because they're so faithful, they're God's chosen people. And so to people often reading this, especially in Amos's time, they totally expect God is going to punish them, these surrounding nations. Of course he is, even though they don't necessarily believe in all of God right at this point. A lot of people have abandoned their faith, but of course they would remember a little bit about how they're supposed to be God's chosen people. And so, sure, yeah, I can see this God destroying all these other evil nations around us. However, Amos then, or God through Amos, then warns Judah and Israel because they have the exact same thing coming their way. Because God says their sins are presented as worse because they had taken God's help and blessing and his presence with them for granted, and they used that blessing to further their sinful ways. Now, God's saying, I've had enough. And that's kind of God's way of communicating, like, the gravy train is done. Chapters 3 and 4, God is saying, you guys, you were my chosen and special people, and you've done nothing good with that blessing. What have you squandered it. And now it's all you do, all you have, all you offer is separate, or is empty rituals. One thing I wanted to mention too, because of this as well, and touching back on chapters 1 and 2, remember I mentioned Israel and Judah. Just a quick note here, if you recall, and if you don't, that's fine. But at one point after Solomon's rule, the one nation had split into two because factions, and remember there's 12 tribes, right? Kind of not getting along, so the kingdom snapped into two, and each kingdom had, north and south, had its own king. For the most part, you would have maybe one or good king every now and then, right? And then you might be followed by one or many more, in a lot of cases, very pagan, very twisted, very not following God kind of rulers. And that's really I think a lot of that fracture from Solomon on really started that downward spiral of Israel, and then also Judah, falling away from God. So which brings us to this point, and all the other prophets as well. And so I wanted to mention that because as we get back to this point, especially in the last point as well, but at this one as well, at this point here, is that Israel is just going through the motions. Yes, they take their offerings to the temple, or they offer up their first veggies out of their garden, or their first fruits out of their garden as a way of not worshiping God, but that's because it's kind of tradition. It's what they do. It's a kind of a chore. So again, we're going to touch upon that here as well, in a little more in depth. Chapter 4, God notes, I've tried to get your attention in many ways, yet you have not returned to me. So now you will fully get what you deserve. That's pretty ominous when you think about it. God is, again, kind of bluntly saying, you've walked away and now see what happens because of it. Chapter 5, Amos, his advice on what to change is basically return to obedience, restore your relationship with God. And again, that idea of obedience. But as we touched on last week, rebellion is kind of the sin nature within us to want to act against that. And so when God often calls us to obedience, our sin, our rebellion, is to go against that. And certainly was the case with the Israelites. Chapter 6 and 7. Complacency and pride have taken them far away from God's standards. So, this idea of they just got so used to not doing or having a relationship with God or doing the things to maintain that relationship, and then also having the pride to be like, well, we don't need him anyway. See, everything's going well. Because again, this was a very prosperous time. That had set so into the mindset of the people, they just never felt the need to go back to God. Which is why God's bringing a warning through the prophets, and especially Amos. Chapter 8, they are going to find out what life is really like without me. That's God's promise. Now, let's remove me from the equation and see what happens. Chapter 9, Israel will be destroyed, and I will start over with the few righteous people left. Now, this is actually a little bit down the road. And what I mean is that Israel is very much destroyed. And there is a small remnant. Yeah, there's little pockets here and there, and eventually they kind of work their way back after generations, work their way back to Israel to rebuild the city, like Nehemiah and Ezekiel. And Esther was someone who lived in Persia and helped save the Jews that were there from being slaughtered because of her act of going to the king, which was very unheard of. Again, you've probably read that story. But the point is, Daniel was someone who went to the Babylonians. Again, these are different times, different generations apart. But the point is that after Israel is destroyed, there are pockets of Jews, there's pockets of Israelites displaced everywhere because of the destruction. And again, God eventually brings them back after generations to kind of start with a clean slate. And that is a very prophetic thing that does take place. God warns it here, and it takes place throughout much of the rest of the Old Testament. So what do we need to learn from Amos, other than that some of the stuff we already mentioned? But what are some really good takeaways? So God does not like empty religious rituals. You've maybe heard that said, maybe you've heard me say it, or maybe a Sunday morning message, but it still holds true, is that if you're just going through the motions, God can tell. So you best try to be real in your relationship, be real in your practice. Amos 5:21 through 24. I hate, this is God speaking, I hate all your show and pretense, your hypocrisy of your religious festivals and solemn assemblies. If you're not familiar, the Jewish calendar had very different festivals at different times of the year. Most often to celebrate some kind of part of the season. Maybe it was first fruits, Passover, things like that. And the Israelites were instructed to keep these dates as holy. And so, again, we're to this point where God's saying, all you're doing is just showing up to do it. Whereas the intent was always to have this kind of relationship with a celebration together, and you've made it not that. All right, moving on, verse 22. I will not accept your burnt offerings and grain offerings. I won't even notice all of your choice peace offerings. Away with your hymns of praise. They only are noise to my ears. I will not listen to your music, no matter how lovely it is. Instead, I want to see a mighty flood of justice, a river of righteous living that will never run dry. So essentially, God says it's not important how lovely you make the music, how maybe let's put it in today's standards. It's not how cool your video is on the screen, your graphics. Whether you're using the best new worship song that's out there, that's not enough if it doesn't have the real intent behind it. If you're not truly living it, and not just on Sunday, but living it throughout your week. So that kind of point brings us to this point. They believe, the Israelites, as we do today, that if we do the churchy things that God expects, if we kind of show up and we not just sit in a seat, maybe you raise your hand and wave it a little bit, right? That's not to say that some of you certainly don't mean it. I'm sure you do. But some people just show up to do the churchy thing and expect the rest of our lives to go on however we want it to make it. And that's again no different than the people that Amos is talking to. And that's really, again, talking about the human condition. This is not an indictment of you and I. It could be if it applies to us. What we're really saying here is that we also should always heed the warning of Amos, in that our practice of our faith should not just be doing things, right? And so that's really what we need to always check. Are we doing this because it just gives us all the good feels? Or is this really being led by the Spirit? Because I'm in the Word and I am praying and so on and so forth. So, I hit the button, I promise. God cares about relationship, not religion. Over religion. He would rather have this thing, again, kind of with the Israelites. He said, you will be my people, not my subjects. He said, I will be your God and you will be my people. And so, if he was just making them his subjects, doing just the act that he told them to do would be sufficient. But again, by being his people, when he asked them to have this festival or offer up this offering, it was supposed to be together with him in relationship. Verse 24 of that same chapter, he wants us to show our love by justice and righteous living, not by religious acts. Again, it's not about the act itself. It's about what it meant to be with him. So, as you might guess, there are consequences to not obeying God's standard. The doi, right? Of course there's consequences. When you act out, if you rebel, there is a consequence. There's an equal consequence to that. If we do not get out of our complacency and pride, and this is true, and this is a message to the Israelites then, but I think, again, to us as today, if we don't get out of that complacency and pride that we might find ourselves in, eventually our churches will not be here, and we will not have the same we will have the same spiritual famine that Amos is describing back then. And what I mean by that is, any church anywhere is only one generation away from closing its doors. We could talk about all the different financial stuff. We can talk about all the stuff that's going on politically around. Yes, those can affect it all. But if people in the church, coming to the church, calling this or that church their home church, but they're not tithing, they're not being involved, you're going to close your doors in 15, 20, 25 years. And that is true of any church anywhere. Regardless how much you might pull in each week, if people are not invested in the life of the church will die. And so imagine that across the nation, what will happen. If you remove a generation, which we are marching towards, by the way, if you're not aware of that, then please take note of that. The generation that I'm speaking to you now, you are the linchpin right now in what continues this on to the next generation still. So the more maybe the less you are involved, the less you are invested, the more closely you will bring about the closing of church across the nation and perhaps the world. No pressure. Right? Feel better now? God can pick and that brings us to our next point. God can pick anyone to do anything and equip them to do it. So if that's a stumbling block for you, fear not. God will equip you to do through his power, not your own. Let's look at Amos 7, 14 and 15. But Amos replied, I am not one of your professional prophets. I certainly never trained to be one. I'm just a shepherd, and I take care of fig trees. Verse 15, but the Lord called me anyway. He called me away from the flock and told me, go and prophesy to the people in Israel. So to change the fate of Christianity, God needs us to get serious about our faith and be obedient to his standards. You do not have to be the pastor, youth pastor, worship leader. You don't have to be the most equipped person. Essentially, if you are dedicated in your faith, whatever God equips you to do, and wherever he sends you to work, wherever that is, you are the missionary there. You are the voice there. And by living out your faith, you reach those people just by virtue of the fact that God has equipped you to go there, yes, to work, to make a paycheck, fine, and to use the gifts he's given you, I agree. But ultimately, it serves more than that purpose. Because if he's placed you there, he's going to use you if you let him. And fulfill the purpose and mission that God has given us. That's really what we're talking about here. Amos is a prime example because he was a shepherd of sorts, a herdsman, okay, but it took care of trees, like an arborist or whatever. The point is that he was farm living, and God still pulled him out of that to give a message that only he could in his way, with his gifts and his talents and his background, and he would deliver it in such a way that would wake people up, shake them up from what was happening, rather than hearing real flowery stuff that they might hear every other day. Amos comes in and just says, God's going to do this, you better listen. And so that was his purpose and his mission. Ours might be different. But let's go to the New Testament and get a little bit more backup on this idea that, we have a purpose and a mission set before us already. Matthew 22:37-40. Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." You've probably heard this before. Second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. All other commandments and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. Jesus is actually hearkening back to, first of all, he's asked a question by the Pharisees, and he's bringing back what the Jews called the Shema from Deuteronomy, which was kind of a creed of sorts, like saying this is what we believe in a very short sentence. But they called it the greatest commandment, which is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and some say strength or whatever. The point is you get the idea, and that was a very common thing to say. But Jesus didn't just add to it. I would even argue that he didn't add to it. He actually brought out what most people forgot or never really paid attention to, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. That is God equipping us. That is God calling us to a mission. Even more so, the Great Commission itself. Matthew 28:19-20. Therefore go and make all disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and then the Son of the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you, and be sure of this, I am with you always, even until the end of the age. Now, why do I bring out these two passages? Well, it's pretty simple. When people look at our life, your life, my life, when they come to our churches, they should see and feel these two passages being lived out by us. It can't just be a play, it can't just be an act. People will see through that. You would, right? And the point is that we need to be truly living those passages because that is our mission. And we need to be obedient to that fully, completely in our own lives and as a community. And by doing so, we will do what the Israelites could not do, not till after their city was destroyed and not till after the remnant came back after many generations. But the point is we can dodge all that, and we're at an interesting time in our own nation, I'm sure, as you can see, regardless of where you are. Put that against what God is saying. Are we as being faithful ourselves in our faith, and are we doing it as faithfully as a community? And with that, I hope you've been encouraged. I hope you've been challenged. And I would also just say or ask that you read the book of Amos and see what he has to say. All right? So we'll talk to you later. We'll see you next week.